The Victorian era, 1837 to 1901, was a time when Great Britain became the workshop of the world and mistress of the seas. Yet behind the facade of industrial greatness, strict morality, and lavish balls lay a social abyss that is difficult for a modern person to imagine. Writer and statesman Benjamin Disraeli aptly called England of that time two nations, the rich and the poor, living side by side, yet in entirely different worlds. Life in 19th century London was strictly segmented. At one pole stood the aristocracy and the growing middle class, whose lives were governed by an intricate code of etiquette. In a typical townhouse in Mayfair or Belgravia, life revolved around servants. The masters existed in clean zones, rarely encountering those who cleaned their fireplaces, cooked their meals, or emptied their chamber pots. For that purpose, there were separate back staircases and narrow service corridors. A symbol of status was dazzlingly white linen. In a city choking on coal soot, maintaining such cleanliness required enormous money and the labor of dozens of laundresses. At the other pole stood the working class. After the Industrial Revolution, London's population grew at an explosive rate. A family of 7 or 8 people often crowded into a single room that served simultaneously as kitchen, bedroom, and workshop. A poor person's diet was meager: bread, tea, occasionally cheap cheese or fish scraps. Fresh meat and vegetables were an unattainable dream. The slums of the East End, such as Whitechapel, entered history as symbols of human suffering. They were called rookeries because of their incredible overcrowding. Until the mid-century, sewage systems in these areas were virtually non-existent. All waste flowed into open ditches directly beneath the windows of homes. The city was saturated with heavy odors, a mixture of horse manure, coal smoke, rotting refuse, and the stench of overflowing graveyards. The smog, known as a pea souper, was so thick that people could literally become lost on their own street. Those who could not afford even a corner in a room went to penny lodging houses. The cheapest option was the two-penny hangover, where a person slept sitting on a bench, leaning against a rope stretched in front of them to keep from falling to the floor. The Victorian economy quite literally rested on the shoulders of children. A poor family could not survive on a father's wages alone, so everyone went to work. Chimney sweeps. Boys as young as 5 were made to crawl into narrow flues. To keep a child from being afraid to climb, masters would sometimes light straw at the bottom. This caused bone deformities, burns, and specific occupational diseases. Miners and factory workers. In the mines, children worked as trappers, sitting in complete darkness for hours, opening ventilation doors. In textile mills, small workers crawled under running machines to tie broken threads. One wrong move could cost a child their fingers or their life. Mudlarks. The poorest children sifted through the toxic mud of the Thames at low tide, hoping to find old nails, coal, or scraps of copper to sell for a few pennies, enough for a crust of bread. While a wealthy Victorian was treated by private doctors with rest and laudanum, an opium tincture, illness for the poor was a death sentence. One of the most terrifying diseases was phossy jaw, suffered by women working in match factories. Fumes from white phosphorus caused the bones of the face to rot while the victim was still alive. The jaw would begin to glow in the dark and gradually decay away. Particularly tragic was the fate of children whose mothers, before leaving for their shift, would give them soothing syrups laced with opium. Infants became lethargic and frequently died from exhaustion or respiratory failure, as the drug suppressed both the sensation of hunger and the suckling reflex. Even in death, the poor were not always left in peace. The bodies of those who died in workhouses were often handed over without the consent of relatives to anatomy theaters for the training of surgeons. In the London of that era, an entire shadow industry existed around the recycling of waste. Pure finders. These people collected dog excrement from the streets and sold it to tanneries for processing fine leather. A cruel irony. A pauper groveling in filth was gathering the raw material that would eventually become elegant ladies' gloves. Toshers. These daring souls ventured into the city's sewer pipes, battling rats and toxic gases in search of lost coins, silverware, or scraps of iron. Rag and bone men. They gathered bones and old rags. Worn clothing was pulped into paper, and bones were rendered into glue and fertilizer. The city quite literally chewed itself up, wasting nothing. For those who had finally exhausted every means of survival, one last road remained: the workhouse. These institutions were deliberately made so harsh that people would fear ending up there. Families were separated, husbands apart from wives, children apart from parents. Inmates were set to hard and pointless labor, such as breaking stones. It was, in effect, a punishment for poverty, which Victorian morality often equated with vice and laziness. The Victorian era was steeped in rigid moralism. Prostitution reached enormous proportions driven by destitution. And although society officially condemned fallen women, the very same gentlemen who voted for strict legislation in Parliament were the primary customers of the brothels of the East End. Religion, too, served as an instrument of control. The poor were taught that their suffering was God's will, and that humility would guarantee them a place in paradise. Charity was frequently humiliating. A bowl of soup was offered only after hours of sermons on sinfulness. Victorian London stands as a monument to human endurance and, at the same time, a warning about what unchecked class inequality leads to. It was a city where the scientific discoveries of Copernicus and Darwin existed alongside medieval living conditions. The greatest achievements of civilization were built here upon the exploitation of those who had no right even to clean water or safe labor. It is precisely this contrast that makes the era so grim, and yet so extraordinarily fascinating to study.